In 1925, a trial began in the small American town of Dayton, Tennessee, that would become the symbol of the battle between science and religion for decades to come. It was called the Scopes Monkey Trial, a trial in which a common school teacher, John T. Scopes, was accused of teaching the theory of evolution. Imagine how a small classroom discussion could become a national intellectual storm. This trial was not about one person, but about a question. Are humans created by God or descended from apes? This question shook the soul of America. Newspaper headlines made headlines, radio debates were held, and the courtroom became a battleground between science and faith. On one side were the defenders of religion, on the other the champions of science, and in the middle a nation wondering, what are we really? First, we need to understand how it all began. A new law was passed in Tennessee, the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach the theory of evolution in any public school. The purpose was to defend the teachings of the Bible, especially the story of the creation of man as described in the book of Genesis. But the tide of modern science was not going to stop. At that time, a new generation was emerging in America that wanted to ask questions. It was at this moment that a schoolteacher, John T. Scopes, thought, can science be chained to the law? He taught his students the theory of Charles Darwin, and thus the law was broken. But the real story had just begun. When a lawsuit was filed against him, and a small town attracted the attention of the whole world, the city of Dayton was suddenly filled with journalists, photographers, and speakers. It was called Monkey Town because the case was about the relationship between apes and humans. Every street was a discussion. Is the Bible completely true, or is science more accurate? People came from far and wide to watch the courtroom as if it were a festival. The case opened a new window on the debate over religion, education, and freedom of thought. Outside the courtroom, pastors were praying, inside the lawyers were arguing, and millions were listening on the radio. It seemed as if the entire country was witnessing a spiritual and scientific riot. This was not just a case about a teacher, but about the right to think. Two major characters emerged in the courtroom, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. Bryan was a prominent politician and religious leader who represented Bible believers. To him, evolution was an insult to God. On the other side was Darrow, not an atheist, but a liberal advocate of thought. To restrict knowledge is a crime against humanity, he said. The two had a great debate. Darrow asked Bryan, do you take every word of the Bible literally? The question echoed in the courtroom. Bryan hesitated, and at that moment the weight of truth hung in the air. People were wondering, is religion really afraid of science? Or is it just the dictates of time? The Dayton courtroom was not just hearing the law, but had become a witness to the struggle of an entire civilization. Outside the courtroom were banners, "Save our children from atheism," and "Let science speak." Two worlds stood face to face. Religion said, man is a creation of God. Science said, man is a product of time and nature. And standing between the two, Scopes, an ordinary teacher, became a symbol to the world, a symbol of knowledge and freedom. He was being tried, but in reality the court was being tried for human reason. During the trial, Darrow changed the style of cross-examination. He presented philosophy, not law. He said, if we stop children from thinking, where will tomorrow's scientists come from? Silence fell in the courtroom. Bryan recited Bible passages and Darrow gave scientific arguments. Both interrupted each other, mocked, and sometimes smiled. But in the background was a bigger story, freedom of thought versus absolute faith. The newspapers called it the trial of the century. The public was divided. On one side were those who were defenders of faith. On the other side were those who were lovers of knowledge. Interestingly, Scopes himself, despite being the center of the trial, remained relatively silent. He had become a symbol of the teacher's sacrifice. During the trial, when the judge ruled that Scopes had broken the law and would be fined, $100, Darrow smiled and said, this is not a fine, it is a medal. This sentence shook the entire courtroom. People realized that this defeat was actually a victory because the debate could not be suppressed. Scopes was convicted, but the question remained. And that is the question that will keep generations thinking. After the trial, the media turned it into a parable. In radio, newspapers, and later in the movies, it was made into a symbol of faith versus knowledge. Some called Darrow a hero, some called him the devil, some called Bryan a martyr, some called him a conservative. But the real victory was for both, because they made the world think. This trial changed the direction of education, religion, and freedom of expression in America. New curricula began to be created in schools. New questions began to be raised in the courts. The Scopes trial opened a door that has never closed again. If you think about it, the Scopes trial was not just a trial of evolution or the Bible, but of man's own intellectual freedom. It says that knowledge cannot be imprisoned. Whether it is religion or the law, if it is afraid of questioning, it is weak. And if he faces the question, he is true. That was the lesson the world learned from that trial. Science and faith are not enemies if both are seekers of truth, but when one wants to destroy the other, then war begins. The Scopes trial showed us that this war never ends. It only changes form. After Bryan died, some people said that faith had won, and some said that science. But in reality, humanity had won, because now the debate was open. Now any teacher, any student could say, I can think. That was the real legacy of the trial. And even today, when we question a theory, that echo of Scopes' classroom echoes, never stop asking why. Perhaps that is the first and last lesson of science. After the Scopes trial, an earthquake shook the American education system. Some states imposed further restrictions on the teaching of evolution, while others began to challenge the law. The country was divided divided into two ideological camps. On one side were those who believed that religion was central to every curriculum, and on the other side were those who believed that science should be independent of religion. Lectures were given in universities, articles were published in newspapers, and debates took place in homes. The Scopes trial was no longer a trial. It had become a movement. The movement's goal was freedom of thought, and it shook the intellectual foundations of America. Religious believers felt their faith was in danger, while modern thinkers said it was time to let science flourish. This was not just a battle of education, it was a battle within man. The trial was over, but the debate was just beginning. For years, columns about the trial continued to appear in newspapers. Films, novels, and theater plays were inspired by the event. The Scopes trial was no longer just a legal dispute, but had become part of America's collective consciousness. For many, the trial had become a metaphor for the relationship between God and man. Some said God lost, some said man won, but in reality, both learned to understand each other. If you think about it, this case still forces us to ask the question today: can faith and science coexist, or will they always be at odds? Over time, the effects of this case began to be seen in the curriculum. Some schools removed mention of evolution from their textbooks, while others kept it as an optional chapter. Some parents said it would weaken children's faith, and others said that faith is only strengthened when it is challenged. This was a time when America was caught between modernism and fundamentalism. The pastors preached on the radio, and the scientists responded. In every city, the debate was going on: can God and Darwin get on the same page? The Scopes trial created a new wave of thought, a wave that changed the minds of generations to come. Whenever in history a wall was erected between science and faith, the memory of the Scopes trial stood as a beacon. By the middle of the 20th century, a new balance had emerged in America. The courts ruled that educational institutions could not preach a particular religious doctrine. This was the lasting effect of the Scopes trial. Although the immediate outcome of the trial was against Scopes, the long-term effect was in his favor. It gave birth to academic freedom, the idea of freeing knowledge from faith. And it was this moment when America began to make scientific thinking part of its educational policies. The echoes of the trial can still be heard every time a teacher dares to ask a question in a school. When we read a scientific theory today, we are actually reading a continuation of Scopes' lesson. The lesson that says, thinking is not a sin, silence is, but the story does not end there. The trial had a profound impact on the lives of both Clarence Darrow and William Jennings. Bryan died a few days later, perhaps from exhaustion or despair. Some said he left the world after the victory of faith, others said he had lost inside. Darrow left the court, but his impact remained. He became a metaphor for freedom of thought. He had said, "I am not against religion. I am against the status quo." This phrase is still written on the walls of American schools today. The debate between Darrow and Bryan proved that the right to think can never be possessed by one person. Every person has his own angle, his own truth, and this is the beauty of human nature. The Scopes trial showed humanity a new mirror, a mirror in which its reason, its fear, and its quest are all seen together. Have you ever wondered how a simple teacher's lesson can change history? This trial was proof of that. An ordinary man, just doing his duty, challenged the entire world's thought system. That was the moment when a classroom became the greatest courthouse in the universe. Years later, the movie Inherit the Wind was made, which was based on the Scopes trial. This movie showed how society is afraid of its own questions. The dialogue between Darrow and Bryan still resonates in this movie today. Does faith kill reason? Or does reason keep faith alive? The question still seems as fresh today as it did in 1925. That is the real power of the Scopes trial. It doesn't get old with time, but deepens. Because as long as people keep asking questions, this case will live on. Have you ever wondered what science education would be like today? If the Scopes trial had not happened, perhaps we would still live in fear of which theory is permissible to study. But the Scopes trial shattered that fear. It showed that knowledge cannot be locked up in walls. If knowledge is locked up, it finds a way out, sometimes through the courtroom door, sometimes through the classroom window. And that was the greatest lesson of this case, that the enemy of knowledge is not theory, but fear. And when a person is free from fear, then he truly learns. When Darrow said to Bryan for the last time, "I am not challenging your God, I am challenging your fear," he was not just speaking a sentence, but making history. Bryan also smiled and replied, "Fear is the first step to faith," and that was the beauty of this case. Both were sincere in their own truth. Perhaps that is why this case never ended. This debate continues today in our schools, homes, and hearts. This case is also memorable because it taught disagreement is not hostility. Two ideologies do not fight, they talk. And when the talk stops, the war begins. The Scopes trial kept the conversation going. That is why this case was not a defeat, but a victory of dialogue. Have you ever wondered what social media would do if such a case had happened today? The hashtag Darrow trial would have trended, memes would have been created, debates would have taken place, and perhaps Scopes would have even been famous on TikTok. But one thing does not change: people's desire to question. This is the greatest power of man. This is what has been alive since 1925. Sometimes history makes us laugh, sometimes it makes us cry, but it always teaches us something. And the Scopes trial taught us that truth never remains silent, no matter how much it is suppressed. Sometimes the greatest lesson of history is not what the judge gives, but what a person hears within himself. When Darrow left the courtroom after the Scopes trial, he looked up to the sky and said, "One day people will understand that this trial was the first step in the evolution of man." Perhaps that day has come. Because even today, when a teacher talks about a new idea, he carries on the legacy of Scopes. And that is the real victory of this trial. Ever wonder if the Scopes trial had happened today, not in 1925? There would have been trends on Twitter, comments on YouTube, memes on Instagram. Bryan's words, "The Bible is the word of God," would have gone viral like a clip. And Darrow's sarcastic response, "Then let God speak for himself," would have received millions of views. But at that time, radio was the only social media. The entire nation was listening to the same story, on the same frequency. That day, the court became a theater, and everyone was a character actor. This was the first time that the media changed the narrative, not the law. Radio hosts dubbed the debate the monkey trial, a combination of humor and interest. Scopes didn't even want to be a hero, but the media made him one. Bryan, Darrow, and Scopes, all three became characters in a story. Time passed, but their words remained preserved in the archives of history. College students still listen to clips of the trial today. This is not just a thing of the past, but an example of the power of the media. How a story can change the thinking of a nation. If this case ended in one court, then it is still being heard in another court, the court of the people, today. And perhaps this is the real victory or defeat, the story that the world remembers. That is the one that wins history. When we say science versus religion, we are probably wrong, because both have the same goal, the search for truth. The only difference is the method. Science questions, religion gives certainty, and man keeps swinging between the two. The Scopes trial showed this balance, that questioning is not a denial of faith, but a depth of faith. Bryan fought for the protection of faith, Darrow for the freedom of reason. Both were right in their own way. Perhaps if they were both alive today, they would not call each other enemies, but companions. This trial does not teach us who won. It teaches us that everyone has the right to think, whether he is a Bible reader or a microscope viewer, because truth is never seen from just one angle. The Scopes trial opened a window, through which we saw that God and science are two stars in the same sky. It's just that each of us sees them in his own way. John T. Scopes, an ordinary teacher, a quiet man. He neither wanted to be famous nor to bring revolution. He simply taught one lesson, Darwin's evolution. And that lesson became history. Years later in an interview he said, "I just taught the children the truth. I had no idea the world would change." This sentence was a testament to his simplicity. He was neither a politician nor a reformer, but he was brave. He took a big step out of his fear. The world made fun of him, but time made him a hero. His silence still resonates after a century. When teachers teach freely in colleges, they are actually paying tribute to Scopes. His name is now written not only in books, but in every mind that dares to ask questions. He reminds us that change is always brought about by those who are stubborn about teaching knowledge, and history is always written in their name. In the end, the question is, what did we learn from the Scopes trial? We learned that freedom is not only of speech, but also of thought. When a system, a law, or a belief prohibits questions, knowledge dies. But when someone says, "I want to know," they take humanity a step further. This trial was not just a debate about religion or science, it was a declaration of faith in man's own reason. Darrow's words still ring true today. Ignorance and arrogance are the enemies of truth. Freedom of thought is not written in a book. It is a fire that burns in the heart, and that fire was lit by Scopes. This trial taught us that courts don't just provide justice. Sometimes they also provide light, and that light spreads through generations. That is the lamp that still burns in the mind of every student today, and that lamp will never go out. Now the question is for you. Yes, for you who are watching this video. If you were in 1925, who would you have sided with? With Bryan, who wanted to protect the faith, or with Darrow, who had the courage to ask questions? Maybe the answer is not so simple, because the truth is always somewhere in between. The Scopes trial gives us a mirror in which we can see our world. Even today, when we reject an idea as dangerous, we are repeating the same mistake that the Dayton court made. Knowledge cannot be imprisoned, and questioning can never be a crime. So the next time you think of something new, don't be afraid. You might as well write history, because every Scopes trial begins in some classroom, and every revolution begins with a question. So keep thinking, keep asking, because this is the most beautiful proof of being human. When we look at America after the Scopes trial, a new wave of thought emerges. In the name of academic freedom, students were given freedom of research in universities, and its effects were felt all over the world. Science education was reintroduced into the curriculum, but religious studies also remained. The two were not considered enemies of each other, but rather comparable. The Scopes trial made America realize that if science and faith respect each other, society progresses. At the same time, several scientific institutions were established that advanced research on the theory of evolution. But at the same time, religious groups also grew stronger. They believed that if faith weakened, the moral system would also collapse. Thus, a new balance was created, where both reason and faith found a place. And this was perhaps the most positive outcome of the trial. When the Cold War began in the 1960s, the spirit of the Scopes trial was revived. The United States increased its investment in science and technology to overtake the Soviet Union. The space race began during this period. But behind all this was an ideological message. Science is not fear, it is power. And this thought was born from the Scopes trial. If evolution had been completely rejected as unbelief in this case, America might not have made so much progress in science. But history has proven that questioning is the foundation of progress. This same thought took man from the Earth to the moon. When Neil Armstrong said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," that phrase actually echoed the lesson of the Scopes trial, because that too was a leap of faith, but this time faith was based on science. The effects of the Scopes trial were not limited to America. The debate on the subject of evolution and creation began in education systems around the world. In Pakistan, India, and the Middle East, this question was also raised: can religion and science coexist? Many schools included both perspectives in the curriculum so that students could decide for themselves. Some countries banned it completely, while others presented it as academic debate. This case became an example of how a courtroom debate can become a global intellectual revolution. It showed the world that education is not just about books, but about thinking. And if thought is constrained, knowledge dies. When we talk about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and quantum physics today, we should remember that these are all extensions of the Scopes trial. The same quest, the same question, the same why. The Scopes trial also had a profound impact on literature. Famous writers such as H.G. Wells, Sinclair Lewis, and Arthur Miller presented the trial as a symbol of human freedom. In novels and plays, the characters of Bryan and Darrow were depicted as representatives of faith, this reason, and each writer, in his own way, explained that the thinking man is actually the most religious, because he is in search of truth. This trial reveals both the strength and its weakness of the human mind. When a society is afraid of questions, it stagnates, but when it embraces questions, it moves towards progress. That was the philosophy of the Scopes trial. If a writer or filmmaker today writes a story about an intellectual war, it is certainly rooted in this trial, because this was the moment when the world saw that a war of words is more powerful than guns. If we look at today's society, we will feel that the echoes of the Scopes trial are still alive. In some parts of America, there are still movements against evolution. Some schools still want to make creationism part of the curriculum, but the difference is that now this debate is not suppressed, but open. People talk, argue, and live together despite their differences. This is the sign of progress and respect despite disagreement. And this is the lesson that this trial taught us. It taught us that a questioner is not an enemy, he is actually a guide to the light. When the internet became popular in the 21st century, the old records of the Scopes trial became digital. Now every student can listen to that original court debate from any corner of the world. It was a new birth for history. Now the Darrow and Bryan conversations are taught not only in books, but in online classrooms. There are reenactments of the trial on YouTube. Documentaries have been made about it on Netflix, and every time a young person watches it, the same question arises in their mind. Am I also looking for the truth? This is the moment when history comes alive. When a case from the past changes the thinking of the present, that case is never old. And the Scopes trial is like that, timeless, but relevant for all times. If you think about it, the Scopes trial has become a metaphor. Today, when a journalist tries to speak the truth, when a teacher goes against the curriculum and tells children the truth, or when a student asks why, they are all continuing the tradition of Scopes. This trial sent the message that knowledge never comes alone. It always comes with courage. And courage is not that which comes from strength, but that which is born from the search for truth. That is why the Scopes trial is not just a historical event, but a philosophy. The philosophy that says thinking is not a crime, but a worship. If we understand this, perhaps humanity will go one step further. In every era of history, there have been events that change the direction of thinking. Like the trial of Galileo, like the death of Socrates, the Scopes trial was also a test of human intelligence. It was the moment when man asked himself, do I want to know? And when he said yes, knowledge knocked on his door. This trial was not just of one state, but of all humanity. And its impact is still present in our schools, courts, and consciences today. Have you ever wondered what Bryan or Darrow would say if they were here today? Bryan would have said, never stop believing. And Darrow would have replied, never stop thinking. And perhaps they would have said, both are possible together. That is the spirit of the Scopes trial. Combination, balance, and dialogue. If we embrace that spirit, then the solution to today's social crisis, religious extremism and intellectual stagnation, lies within it. Because both knowledge and faith are light, just different colors of light. In the end, if we draw one conclusion, it would be that the Scopes trial taught the world this lesson. The path of knowledge is never straight, but it always leads to light. This trial reminds us that in the pursuit of truth, victory or defeat has no meaning, it has intention. Scopes lost, but humanity won. And this victory continues today. Every time a child asks his teacher why, Scopes smiles, because that was its purpose, and to keep the question alive. And as long as the question is alive, humanity is alive. So now the question to you, do you want a world where thought is a crime? Or one where every question can become a new answer? The decision is yours. But remember, history always favors those who ask the question. And that is the final, greatest, and brightest lesson of the Scopes trial.